Come on in, and there's some treats at the back. If you haven't gotten those yet, we would welcome you to have some popcorn and snacks and some warm or cold drinks, whatever you'd like, and we'll get started here in just a couple minutes. You can still talk. Yeah. You can still talk to each other. Like, that wasn't meant to, a couple minutes, then no more talking ever again. Thanks for being here, though. Well, hello. Thank you so much, everyone who's come out tonight. We have a full house, and we're so grateful for that. And for those of you who are joining us online, whether live time or whether you're catching this as you listen to it as a podcast or are sitting at your computer, we're so grateful that you have taken the time to be part of just this vital and important conversation about the intersection of faith and life and politics. I'm Sarah Wilhelm Garbers. I am one of the ministers at Meeting House Church, and again, we're so grateful whether you are a friend of someone, a community member more broadly, or call Meeting House your home. We're so grateful that you've taken the time to be here tonight. The conversation about faith and justice, and faith and any number of things, is part of a heartbeat of our church, as a place that believes that living faithfully as Christians in the world, whether it be in conversation with science or psychology or politics, wrestling as people of faith, taking seriously that invitation of the gospel and what it means to be Christian in our time is something that we want to do. And so we periodically host spaces such as this around different conversations related to faith and justice. And tonight we are so grateful and honored to be able to have with us not only wonderful human and thinker and speaker, pastor and teacher, also someone I quoted in my dissertation on Christian nationalism. It's a real person. So it makes me so excited because I don't nerd out about pop stars. I nerd out about people who write books. So we are so grateful to have you with us tonight, Reverend Angela Denker. She is ordained as an Evangelical Lutheran Church in America minister, and in addition to being a pastor, is a journalist. She has written for many publications, including Sports Illustrated, The Washington Post, and Fortune magazine, and has been interviewed and featured on shows on CNN, the BBC, Sky News, and NPR, specifically around her work around politics and Christian nationalism in the United States. The book, which we do have available for sale in the back here, there's also a sign-up if we run out of copies, is Red State Christians. And in it, she shares both her own story, but then also through interviews and deeper conversation and analysis, the journey into White Christian nationalism, the wreckage it leaves behind. And it's really about seeking to understand voters who elected Donald Trump. It was selected in 2019 as a Silver Forward Indies Award winner for political and social science books. And this is the new edition of the book, actually, with the title here, The Journey into White Christian Nationalism. That's what's really funny is when I saw it, I was like, that's not, I think, what it was before, was it? Nope, it's the new title. You can get the new edition of it, A Journey into White Christian Nationalism and the Wreckage it Leaves Behind. It was released in 2022, August, and it incorporates and includes the impact of COVID and of George Floyd and religious violence in the United States. Angela has served as a minister, served for 3 years at Grace Lutheran Church in Browntown, Minnesota. Brownton? Sorry, I'm not from there, I apologize. That's like, when you make people on shows pronounce Minnesotan names generally and they mess them all up. I am a Minnesotan, and yet I messed it up, I apologize. And she's currently working on a new book about the rising radicalization of young white Christian boys and men in the United States and what to do about it. This is slated for release in spring of 2025. And as part of how I said, not only is she a pastor, a journalist, and a writer, she is also more broadly a human who is partnered with Ben, her husband, and has 2 sons, and they live together in Southwest Minneapolis. And we're passing around, if you want to subscribe to her newsletter, there's a sign-up spreadsheet somewhere around here, and just keep it going. We'll pass the money bucket next. No, we won't. But you will just get the sign-up invitation. And so with that, as we gather, and right before as we welcome her, will you join me in prayer? God, we give you thanks that you are a God who has been present with people in all places, in all times, in the midst of all political arrangements, functions, dysfunctions, violences, hope, all of the space. So we give you thanks because that reminds us that you are a God who is present with us in the midst of all the violence and upheaval and longing and pain and all of the many things of politics and life in our time. So we pray that your Spirit would be present in this place with us tonight. For we are a people who desire to be faithful, to know what it means to not only follow the God who shares and is the embodiment of all good news, but also we want to be formed to be people who are of a kingdom that is not of this earth, that is not by power or by might, but a kingdom that is of your Spirit. So it's to this end that we pray and we work. And in all things we give you thanks for your love and grace in Christ. In your name, amen. So let us welcome up together Angela Denker. She shares.
Well, good evening. I'm very glad to be with all of you tonight, and it's been a busy week around these parts, especially for those of us who have little kids. We were out hitting the trick-or-treat houses in Southwest Minneapolis on Tuesday night, I think for about 2 hours. So with my 8-year-old, and my 11-year-old went with his friends for the first time. They did have one parent with them, so we'll see. But I am so glad to be with you, and I'm also a little bit embarrassed and surprised that this is my first time here at Meeting House, because part of my own ministry story, and really part of the story of this book, runs through this place. So let me tell you about that a little bit before we begin. If you've read Red State Christians and you read about the story of when I'm serving on internship in Las Vegas, yes, I see some people saying it. And we're, trying to navigate how to celebrate the 4th of July and also recognize the independence of God apart from America. That church, that senior pastor there who taught me as an intern pastor was Mark Wickstrom, who was once a youth pastor here years ago. And then when I was beginning work on Red State Christian, so Mark actually wrote an endorsement for the book, and I looked in here, And I didn't see it in there, so I'm wondering what happened to it. Maybe it was only in the hardcover, but he did endorse it, so you might recognize him. And if you all can just spare a thought and a prayer for Mark, he's going through some cancer stuff right now, as I'm sure many of you know, and very hard to believe because the man did not age for decades, but very special guy to me. And then when I was beginning to think about first writing a book about the 2016 election, my initial focus was only on Southern California and specifically on Orange County Christianity as a place that really began to embrace the type of pop culture Christianity that Donald Trump fit very well into. So I initially came to, at that time, Fortress Press with an idea for a book that centered on Orange County Christianity. If you look in the table of contents, one of the chapter titles was the initial title of the book. So I'm not going to say it aloud up here, but you can look through and find out which one that was. It'll be readily apparent. But so I initially came to the publisher with this idea, and at that time, the editor who was leading this Theology for the People series was Tony Jones. And he really wanted to do a book on the 2016 election. So many meeting house connections with the way that this book and this work came to be. So I feel like it's been a long time coming for me to come and actually be here with you. And I do see some familiar faces, so thank you again for being here if we've met before. As mentioned, I only live about 10 minutes away, so I'm sure I'll be back at some point. So I want to begin tonight kind of by taking a broad view of this work, and then we're going to go from when the work began, really in 2017, 2018, 2019, which is when the book first came out, to first kind of understanding some of these trends that are happening in Christianity and American politics. And then we're going to zoom through 2019 to 2022, those three focus areas that continued to really shape how Christianity was understood in this country through a political lens, specifically around COVID, around George Floyd, and around January 6th. Those are three of the main topic areas that are covered in this new edition of the book. And one of those is really personal to me because my husband's brother died of COVID. And we were walking through that whole journey, not only for me as a researcher and as a pastor, and as Sarah mentioned, rural Minnesota. So I've served in Orange County, California, Las Vegas, Chicago suburbs, Minneapolis suburbs, and rural Minnesota. So we're covering all the bases here. But we're going to talk about each of those things and how they've continued to shape this discussion. Then we're going to zoom right up to our present moment. Because as I'm sure many of you know, this sense of Christian nationalism and this sense that many white Christians in America in particular are feeling embattled and feeling this sense that there needs to be power taken back and power taken in the hands of white Christians. We're going to talk about what's happening really in right now, these very moments. So looking at how Christian nationalism has shaped the recent Speaker of the House elections in the U.S. Congress. We're going to talk about the tragic shooting in Maine not too long ago. And we're going to talk about Israel and Palestine. So buckle up. And what I think is going to be most important, though, because as I keep circling back to, I've done a lot of things in my past. I was a sports writer. I continue to be a journalist. But at heart, I am a pastor. Right? And so the most important thing that I want to do with all of you tonight, as we kind of talk about these current events, ideas, we talk about what all of us are seeing in the news, what I really want to do before we get to the discussion point, which I'm hoping to get to about 7, is I want to give you a definition of Christian nationalism. Because I think a lot of us hear these words, but a lot of people use those words and we don't necessarily understand what we're saying. So I'm going to give you a definition of Christian nationalism, and I'll make sure to have maybe these guys send it out at the end too. And then we're going to do a close study of a passage in the Bible that's going to help not only flesh out what Jesus had to say about Christian nationalism, about the theology of glory, the theology of the cross, but it's also a conversation between Jesus and Pilate that's very instructive for all of us when we're getting ready to go into political dialogue that has to do with politics and religion. Because as you might imagine, when people hear what I have written about, I'm really, really popular at parties. So I want to give you some tools and some understanding so that we can have productive conversations, so that we can bring the hope of the cross and of Jesus back into our conversations, into our communities. We can have hope in what the local church does. And I do have hope every time I do these gatherings at local churches. The fact that I'm still doing them 4 years after this book first came out shows me that there's a lot of people who want to understand each other, want to understand God, and want to work for something hopeful. So that is my hope for tonight. So let's kind of dive in. So the initial task of Red State Christians when I began this book and sort of my mission that I was given by the publisher was to very broadly, the subtitle was Understanding the Christian Voters. The word Christian wasn't in there because it's in the title, but Understanding the Christian Voters who elected Donald Trump. Now, this was at the time, 2019, when if you put Donald Trump's name on any book, you could increase, number of sales a certain amount. So they took full advantage of that. But so my task was to really go out and talk to people and to tell stories and to get a sense not only regionally, but also to look at many of these different interest areas that have historically been important to Christian voters, especially evangelical Christian voters in the U.S. over the last several decades, specifically after Ronald Reagan was president. So I took that task on head first. I went to rural Missouri. I went to Florida and interviewed Paula White. Does anyone remember who Paula White is? Yes. So Paula White represents a really interesting intersection of what Trump did that changed the face of American Christianity and American politics. What Trump did is bring together two groups that had formerly been disparate. So you had, on one hand, sort of the traditional Southern Baptist-esque conservative Christian voting bloc, right? So this would be Billy Graham fans, Jerry Falwell, moral majority, very Southern, not only found in Southern states, but kind of understood as Bible Belt Christians. What Trump did is he brought that group together with a group that has been rising in numbers in American Christianity for the past several decades. It is a group that is much more racially diverse, also a little bit more gender parity. Sometimes there's women pastors if they're married to the male pastor in this group. But this is more of a Pentecostal group, and it's also a popular Christianity group. So Joel Osteen, prosperity gospel preachers, one of my mom's favorites. What's her name? Joyce Meyer. Yes, you see, read my mind. And this brought together, again, these two separate movements that if you look at conservative politics in much of America, especially where it intersects with evangelical Christianity, you can see these two groups coming together in the election of Donald Trump. So the one group, on the one hand, very rooted in prosperity gospel, very rooted in this sense that if you pray the right prayers, if you give enough money to the church, that you yourself are going to be wealthy. Now, wealth, of course, a big part of Trump's brand. So you have that group on one hand, and that group represents a growing edge for American Christianity for especially the past several decades. On the other hand, you have a group that really comes out of much of Southern evangelical conservative Christianity, really much of it even still rooted in a reaction after the Civil War. So sort of this sense of coming back from a loss. And you can see a lot of that same rhetoric in white Southern evangelical Christianity, even up to this day, even though it's been a very long time since the Civil War. There's still a sense in which we have to get our country back. And so what Trump did is brought these two strings together. And the main way that he convinced these two, at one time, very different groups, because on one hand, you have a group that was very critical of Bill Clinton because of adultery, because of multiple marriages, because of divorces. You have a group that was very socially conservative. And then you had a group, on the other hand, that was much more concerned with following the lessons of pop culture. So these are churches that come out of the church growth movement. So we've got, when the pastor comes up and stands on the stage, you've got smoke behind the pastor and fireworks and all sorts of things happening. You have kids going to Sunday school in a big ark. And I talk about these things with love in my heart because I have served some of these congregations in my past. And there's a lot to love about it too, So whenever I talk about any of these trends, I talk about them as someone who was formed by popular American Christianity and whose family has been very rooted in it. So please understand it comes from a place of love, but also from a place of wanting to notice where things started to go wrong. And so what brought these two, at one time, very different groups together were a couple of things. On one hand, power, a promise of political power that had long been denied. If you look even at the U.S. Congress today, we had Minnesota Representative Tom Emmer up for Speaker of the House for how many hours? 4. Emmer represents a form of republicanism that was dominant in the U.S. for a long time. That form of republicanism was very much resented by a lot of the Christians who came together to support Donald Trump. And so as Emmer's very brief candidacy for speaker demonstrates, there's a new kind of conservatism and Christian conservatism that's ascendant in American politics. As this other, for many of us as Minnesotans, I, many, many years ago, interned for Jim Ramstead. Yes. That's a very familiar form of republicanism, and it is fading. So you have these two groups brought together. They were brought together by political power, and they were also brought together by money. So one of the consistent things about all of the Christian leaders who came behind to rally behind Donald Trump, one thing that was consistent for all of them is that they made a lot of money. Whether it was having access to new viewers or new people who were going to buy their books or access to different places of political power, there's access to power and money. So that theme is going to go throughout much of what we talk about tonight. So I started out talking about Paula White. I went down to Florida, interviewed Paula White. Paula White is an example of that prosperity gospel. She's married, I think, to one of the members of the band. I think it's Journey. I'm going to be proven wrong. But she's married to a rock star. She has a green room that she gets ready before she preaches in. And she preaches to a congregation that is rural and almost entirely African American. And so I bring her up and she's also a woman. I bring her up because it shows that Trump broke down a lot of barriers between Christians that used to not get along at all. And he brought them together because what they wanted more than their principles or their ideology or their traditions was power and money. And so you never would have really maybe thought originally that Paula White and the Falwells and Robert Jeffress in Dallas, that all these people would be on the same team. Wheaton College, but they all came together for this pursuit of power and money. And I say that also knowing there's some wonderful people at Wheaton too. It's a mix. So I went to Florida. I went to 3 different places in Texas. I had a chapter on abortion. I had a chapter on immigration. I spent time at the U.S.-Mexico border. I went back to Orange County, California. And as I did that reporting, what came out were 4 different themes. There's a theme first of surprise. And that's something I've tried to carry with me as I've continued to do this work, and something that I would encourage all of us to just continue to cultivate within yourself. If you're wanting to do work across political lines, if you're wanting to do work of having dialogue in Christian and political settings, cultivate within yourself a capacity for surprise. And one thing I noticed while I was doing this reporting work, and especially in the years since, and especially since COVID, that in some ways it's become really difficult to be surprised anymore. And that's because, I think partially because of social media. And so when you know a few facts about someone, a few demographic facts, where they live, what they do for a living, maybe what they're wearing, what they look like, what's their race, what's their ethnicity, we all can kind of really quickly go through in our minds, and knowing those facts make some real assumptions about the person we meet before we talk to them. And we do it to each other all the time, and I think we do it so much because we constantly have to size up each other, whether it's online or in person, and we don't really have a lot of time to talk to each other. And so there's this really quick sizing up that happens of one another. And I noticed, too, that I was doing it. I noticed I was doing it sometimes when I was first touring after the book came out, and I was doing a lot of speaking engagements in very conservative areas. And I would have the guy come in with a very gruff manner, in oftentimes a Vietnam veteran's jacket. And I would say, well, I got something to say. And I would start feeling myself get nervous because I thought he was going to be angry at me. And my father-in-law is a Vietnam veteran. But I noticed that I was making assumptions about that person before he even asked me his question. And most of the time, it was a very gentle and loving and kind question. So I noticed just as they were probably making assumptions about me, I was making assumptions about them. And when we lose that capacity to surprise one another, and you see this intensely in American politics, we have become so hyper-partisan that it's very difficult for politicians to surprise one another anymore either. But the thing is, as Christians who follow the leadership of the Holy Spirit and who worship a God who died and rose again, we cannot lose that capacity to be surprised. Because God in the Holy Spirit often works in the most surprising places, in the most surprising people. So I'm constantly working within myself to continue to cultivate a capacity to be surprised, because it is in those moments of surprise and conversation that new ground can be broken, that change can happen. I'm sure you've seen that here. You all have been through some hard changes, right? And what happens is that often it takes a surprise or a willingness to be surprised for change and positive new change to happen. Now, the second thing that happened after surprise is that I was surprised in a way that I didn't expect to be. And that was in the very first research trip that I did. I traveled to Washington, D.C. I was meeting with some different politicians, some different political leaders, some different evangelical leaders. And I walked into a hotel room that was kind of the central hub for the Evangelicals for Life, March for Life kind of gathering place. And I met with a pastor there named Dean and Sarah. He is still a Southern Baptist pastor. He's working in Florida, in Tallahassee, I believe. And he had a message he desperately wanted me to hear. And so he came to me, and this was a time, January 2018. So this was at the very near beginning of Trump's presidency. Trump was about to address the March for Life for the first time as a seated president. Roe v. Wade was still in effect in the U.S. Many things have changed since then. Pastor and Sarah came to me and he said, as you write this book and as you do this research, I want you to understand that Christian nationalism is a crisis in the Southern Baptist Convention. And he said Christian nationalism has gotten so powerful in the SBC that it has become a gospel distortion. So that he said people in the Southern Baptist Convention, and I would say this extends to much of American Christianity, but he was speaking as a member of the executive board of the Ethics and Religious Leadership Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, a group that became kind of a punching bag for Trump for a while, led by Russell Moore, who's become a critic of Trump but still an evangelical leader. This was before any of that happened. But Pastor and Sarah over and over repeated to me for the course of about an hour-long conversation that this gospel distortion of Christian nationalism was the greatest threat that he had seen to the Southern Baptist Convention. And at this time, Christian nationalism was not a word that people were talking about very often. But what he said is that Christian nationalism, this teaching that we need to, as Christians, protect the power of America, the power of specific politicians, more so than we needed to protect the gospel of Jesus, had gotten so powerful that it had distorted the gospel of Jesus. He said, if you go to a Southern Baptist church, and again, this goes beyond the SBC, but he's speaking in an SBC context. If you go to a Southern Baptist church on 4th of July weekend, Memorial Day weekend, he said, you're not going to feel like you're at a church. You're going to feel like you're sitting at a baseball game eating a hot dog. Because we, and I'll say we, all of us, to a big extent, as white Christians in America, we had gotten so good at teaching about America and the story of America. And I know you all have had this conversation here. We had gotten so good at doing that we had neglected to teach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so when I first started, again, talking about this book and Christian nationalism in 2019, beginning of 2020, one of the things that I would always say to groups is, we remember Jesus is not American. Yeah. Thank you. Who said that? Yeah. We're getting there. Yeah, I would say that, and everyone would kind of chuckle and look around at each other. I remember, for some reason, I remember specifically saying that at a gathering that I was teaching at in February 2020, before the world changed. February 2020, I was teaching at a large church in Naples, Florida. And if you've ever been down to Naples, it's a pretty nice place. There's a lot of white Christian power and wealth in Naples. And so when you say Jesus is not American, it's like we all know it. But there's also, I think there's this realization that for many of us as white Christians, we've also kind of thought, but Jesus is one of us. And so there's this unteaching and reteaching that has to be done because the gospel has become so distorted that we've lost this rooted story of Jesus as a brown-skinned Jew growing up in the Middle East. And as someone who was not only not a political leader, but someone who was such a threat to the establishment of political and religious power that they crucified him, that they sentenced him to capital punishment. Jesus was so against the kind of government power of religion that is espoused today by Christian nationalists in America. He was such a threat to that ideology that he was crucified. And so Christian nationalism and this warning of Christian nationalism that I heard first became this ideology that permeated really the rest of the reporting that I would do. So I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Pastor and Sarah. I actually haven't talked to him since then. And I'm wondering if he regrets having that conversation with me, because probably some of his fellow pastors didn't appreciate it much. But that was back in January. And then I spent the rest of the year continuing to research and report. And I saw Christian nationalism kind of rearing its ugly head everywhere I went. And what was so tough about that is that so many of the places I went and the people who I met were also some of the best of what America has to offer. Now, I spent a lot of time in Appalachia. I spent a lot of time in churches and communities that were struggling, places where people had suffered a great deal, places where there was a huge amount of poverty. And I saw people holding on to their faith, and I saw these little local churches continuing to meet, continuing to try to provide for families in need. And I saw these local pastors and church leaders and volunteers trying to continue to do the work that the church had called them to do, whether it was work in anti-poverty movements, whether it was work in caring for refugees and immigrants, whether it was work in helping the people understand the Bible. And I saw them doing this work against an impending storm of folks that were most of the time coming from the outside in highly organized groups in order to promulgate a religious and political movement that had nothing to do with the Jesus of the Bible. So the last two words that I encountered as I continued to do this reporting work, and you can read all the stories of the really amazing people who I met in the book. The last two words were opportunity and hope. Opportunity really centered on the stories that I encountered in El Paso, Texas, and across the border in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. And seeing how all these disparate Christians at the U.S.-Mexico border, you know, it's pretty easy for all of us to have really strong convictions about what we think should happen on the border when we're thousands of miles away, although we are close to Canada. But what I saw in these border regions is something that I saw in the ministry of Jesus, was that Jesus continued to cross borders and continued to step into spaces that were unfamiliar and to work with people who were unfamiliar with one another. And I saw the Christians, you know, they weren't perfect, right? But the Christians who I talked to, whether they were Southern Baptists, Catholics, Lutherans, Hispanic, white, multiracial, Christians who I met working and living at the U.S.-Mexico border, one of the pastors there told me the thing that he had to hold within his heart, no matter what else happened. Now, this is a guy who came from a family where on one side, his mom's family had come over from Mexico pretty recently. On the other side, he had a dad, a brother, a granddad, all of whom were military veterans. He had Border Patrol members and dreamers within his congregation. And so he's balancing all these different things, and he's going to college online, I think at the time, for Liberty University, trying to get his ministry credentials. And what he told me was that in the midst of all this swirling stuff, that what he had to hold on to is that people were human beings. Those Border Patrol members in his congregation, those people who were coming across the border in search of a better life, fleeing poverty, fleeing violence, those people who had been in El Paso maybe for one generation and then turned around and discriminated against new immigrants. All these different people living and working in these borderlands. He said what he held most tightly was that people had to be human beings first. And it sounds pretty simple, right? Of course. But again, going back to this sense that it's hard for us to be surprised anymore. That when we learn demographic data about one another, that we think we know everything about the other person. I think his words are something that I had to hold on to. And they were words that gave rise to opportunity. Because when we meet one another as human beings first and as Christians, it's not just about being human beings first, but it also means that when I meet you and when I see you, I see in you and you see in me the image of God. That we were, every single one of us, created in the image of God. And with that as our guiding center, it leads us to have conversations and to make policy decisions based in compassion and love and truth and justice. The final word after that opportunity was hope. And I'm going to use that idea to bring us into the current moment and then into this discussion of a Bible passage and a definition of Christian nationalism. So this final word, hope, and this sense that hope is sometimes fragile and sometimes hidden in clay jars. It came to me when I was spending time in Appalachia and the Rust Belt, region that was pivotal to Trump's election, region that was also pivotal to Biden's election in 2020. And for white Christians, probably the most impoverished region of the country. And again, God surprised me with hope in Appalachia because it's a land of contrast. I don't know if anyone here is from that region, has spent much time there. But as you go there, you're struck by the incredible beauty of the green mountains and the land and the hollers. And I was also struck by the extreme poverty, the likes of which I had not seen anywhere else in this country. And I would meet many of the people who I met in the local churches there and local pastors. If you meet them and they told me how old they were, I would have guessed they were decades older than they actually were. Because of the toll that hard work, working in factories, working in mines, in some cases, opioid epidemic, in some cases, not great access to good nutrition, all these things took their toll on people. And so as a Lutheran going to central Pennsylvania, we went to a place where sometimes we have more Lutheran churches than we have Lutheran people. Because this was a big German area, we planted a lot of churches, and not a lot of people go to them anymore all the time now. So I went to one of those churches in proud Appalachian town called Hollidaysburg, right next to a larger town called Altoona, where Trump held a huge political rally, I think in 2015, early 2016. But I came to Hollidaysburg and I went to the Saturday night service, and I had this incredible reminder that I've carried with me as I continue to do this work of where hope is housed and what we often misunderstand about hope. And it's going to tie into, as we talk about this biblical understanding of Christian nationalism. And so I was at this worship service. There was hardly anybody there. And they had a pastor who was actually an interim pastor because they couldn't find a full-time permanent pastor. So they had to have kind of drag this pastor out of retirement to come and preside over the service on a Saturday night. And I remember looking around at the congregation, and I remember in particular there was one little girl there who was probably 3 or 4 years old, and she was wearing a pink tutu and pink ballet slippers I think she was probably the only kid there. And I remember just thinking in my head, like, gosh, what is this little girl going to think about church? You know, is she going to think that it's this place that's kind of sad and that's dying? And so we're going through the service, and the pastor gave a sermon that I couldn't relate to at all. And then he begins to go through the communion liturgy. And as he gets through the first part of the communion liturgy, he kind of takes a step back, looks around. And then I think which I have much more sympathy now as the longer I get into ministry. I was a little overly judgmental of him, trust me, because I'm sure I'm going to do this at some point. But he got through the communion liturgy, and they took a step back, and then it was like he forgot he had done the whole thing, and so he did the entire thing again. Again, I'm sure I will do this at some point if I haven't already. But so he's going, and I'm just filled with this incredible sense of despair, because here I am. I was making this trip to Appalachia in June. And at that point, I had done so much touring already, and I had been in these huge auditoriums and arenas and concert halls filled with Christians just screaming and shouting and supporting these churches where their rhetoric was all about power and money and rah America, and there's very little Jesus. And I'd seen how popular they were. And here I was in this church that just seemed like there was nothing left. And so he did get through the communion liturgy, and ultimately we're all invited up to receive communion in the tradition of a lot of Lutheran or Catholic churches, where you come up and you receive the wafer, and then you get a small cup of wine. And as I remember when I came up, kind of cynical, frustrated, sad, jaded, unsure, I remember receiving the bread in my hand, and I hear, "This is the body of Christ given for you. This is the blood of Christ shed for you." And what it did for me in that moment is honestly made me feel a little bit embarrassed. Because what it did for me is remind me that Jesus had chosen to be right there. And all I was thinking about was how bad it was, and how much better it should have been, and how many more people should have been there, and how the church should have been more successful. And I was still in that mindset of church growth and prosperity and big youth groups and big programs and trunk or treats and preschool and all the things that I had done at the churches I'd worked at. And I was reminded humbly that Jesus was fully present right here. And it was in that theology of the cross, because what the theology of the cross teaches is that when you feel most rejected and like the biggest failure of the world, it's in that very moment that God does God's most powerful work, much as God did God's most powerful work as Jesus was on the cross. So I took that moment from Appalachia with me to remind me that hope, as God gives us, is very different than the kind of hope that the world offers. And it's really hard to hold on to that kind of hope, because we all still have to pay our bills, right? We have to subscribe to some sort of economic capitalism in order to survive in America. And at the same time, Jesus is calling us as Christians to a rejection of the kind of religion that prioritizes the same growth and prosperity and wealth and power that we have long championed in America. So I had my 4 words. I was talking about the book. Everything's going great. Boom, theology of the cross. We have COVID. You're not touring anywhere or doing anything anymore. Luckily, I got to go to Naples first, right? So March 2020, we go through COVID. And part of what I walked through with my family and also with my rural congregation was really this watershed moment for me in that I was no longer going to defer to a Christian movement that would give itself the label pro-life and would at the same time be willing to sacrifice however many American lives were necessary in order to fuel the economic engine of this country and of this country's churches. And I had to experience that, as I said, in such an incredibly painful way because my brother-in-law who died of COVID, you know, he was in great health. He was a weightlifter, early 40s, he had little kids. And he really had listened to all that messaging that said, well, this isn't really real. And if anything, it's from China. And China's to blame, and the vaccines aren't going to be helpful, all these other things aren't going to be helpful, but Trump will find a way out of it. And I heard that kind of rhetoric from even my nieces for a long time. And so as my brother-in-law went through his hospitalization, and I was pastoring a church in rural Minnesota, and I have my kids in the Minneapolis public schools. So my kids were in online school for a very long time. The kids at the church, in the church schools out in rural McLeod County, they were back in school very early. So I'm trying to navigate two very different worlds. And at the same time, undergoing this family tragedy where my brother-in-law was on an ECMO machine for several months and waiting, hoping maybe for a lung transplant. And what happened again in the aftermath of going through all this tragedy, going through at the same time with my husband's family, the death of George Floyd, and feeling this further call to speak and to say, as someone did say back there, that not only is Jesus not American, but Jesus also is not white. And what that really means in a white Christian context, where we have long assumed that Jesus is one of us. What does it mean to look at our own culpability, even as maybe nice, white, progressive Minnesotans, in ongoing racism? So we walked through that, walked through January 6th. On the night of January 6th, we had a Zoom council meeting with my church council out in Brownton, Minnesota, in a county where I think 70 to 80% voted for Trump in 2020 as well. And I remember there was like a little opening of a window on the evening of January 6th, because all of us had been watching the scenes from the Capitol that day, and there was no denying this violent fervor in the air, much of which was supported by a sense that God has ordained this, that Christians need to take back the country. I remember there was a little bit of a window that opened with my church council where there was some space to talk about, this is happening in a country and among people that have been ravaged by a global pandemic now for almost a year, January 6, 2021. And so there was just a rawness and a pain, and there was finally maybe a willingness to discuss what was going on. Now that window shut really quickly. But a couple of points of hope after those two things happened. First of all, as I imagine many of you can relate to, we had some painful political discussions in my family, and with my husband's family, whether it was after George Floyd and my decision to go and march in anti-racism marches here in Minneapolis, and my father-in-law's sense of extreme pain and anger around that. And also I think that there's a sense, that a lot of the white, and I'm beginning to do some of this work in my new book around men and boys, but a lot of the intense anger and defensiveness that comes into folks who've bought onto these ideas of Christian nationalism. Some of it is rooted all the way back in the end of the Civil War for a lot of Southern white Christians. But there's also a hangover after Vietnam for a lot of baby boomer men. So I come from a family with a lot of military veterans. I think I mentioned my father-in-law is a Vietnam veteran. My grandfather served in World War II. We've got a lot of Marines in the family. I served my chaplaincy at the VA Medical Center here in Minneapolis. But, you know, it was always surprising for me sometimes at how many Vietnam veterans wanted to support Trump, because I thought, here's these guys that had to go over and serve in this war that was never really fully explained for the most part. They didn't always know where they were going, what they were doing. They had to witness and experience all kinds of tragedy and atrocities. Many experienced injuries. Many came home with PTSD, things maybe they could never talk about. Many of them weren't welcomed home with a whole lot of fanfare. But they went and they served their country. And Trump, of course, famously didn't, avoided it. So that surprised me, you know, well, why do you want to follow somebody who wasn't willing to do the same thing that you did? But I think a lot of it does come out of this sense of pain and shame and a feeling of something that was lost. You know, and for World War II, for a lot of veterans of World War II, there's a very clear sense of why we're there, what we're doing. And there was a very clear sense of victory. That was something that was not afforded to Vietnam veterans. And so I think that there's a whole group of Americans, and especially veterans, and especially white men, for whom there's a sense of shame and defensiveness to want to recapture an identity of being victorious and being strong and being successful. And Trump and the Christian nationalist movement more broadly has offered a sense of that identity to a lot of folks. And military language and rhetoric is a huge hallmark of this movement, particularly this idea of sacrifice. I talk about this in detail in the first chapter of the book. But there's a sense in which the Christian nationalist movement, we'll get to this in the definition, what it does is it takes the death of Jesus and makes it analogous to sacrifices of the American military. And so it says that Jesus' sacrificial death was toward the same end as sacrifices of the American military. Now, if we look back to when I was talking about that pastor in El Paso and his mission that each and every person deserves to be seen as a human being first, the sense that the military in general becomes a larger symbol of power and sacrifice and might, what it does is denies each individual military member their own story and their own humanity. And instead, the military more broadly just gets to be a prop or a symbol of Christian nationalist strength. And so you saw this really powerfully, of course, during the racial justice protests in Washington, D.C., when Trump, flanked by a couple of military members, was photographed holding a Bible in front of a church. And so there's this ongoing use, and this is what happens in Christian nationalism more broadly. There's an ongoing use of individual people as props or as symbols of something much larger. And so individual people often don't get to have their own individual stories. Okay, we're going to whip real quickly through a couple of recent events. The new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, probably one of the most overt Christian nationalists ever to ascend to a high level of political power in this country. There's an article from MSNBC written by a journalist named Sarah Posner, Posner, and she writes in great detail about the organization, this legal organization that Mike Johnson comes out of, the Alliance Defending Freedom, and is familiar with ADF. one of the most powerful right-wing conservative organizations in this country. And one thing I'll just mention quickly about ADF, this name, Alliance Defending Freedom. So they've been behind many of the recent Supreme Court decisions. They were instrumental in getting some of Trump's nominees added on to the Supreme Court. They were instrumental in helping to elevate these folks with very dynamic Christian nationalist views, and also with this exclusionary sense of rights, especially for LGBTQ people in this country. Alliance Defending Freedom, that sounds pretty good, right? We like freedom. What it does is it reminds me of a lot of the evangelical megachurches. If you go onto websites, there's a lot of vague language that sounds pretty good. So, everyone is welcome to come here. We believe in God. We have a lot of fun here. And there's a real inability to pin people down on what they actually mean. And so what I see in a lot of cases, especially with people, maybe my age, people in their 30s, 40s, maybe people a little bit younger, people who didn't grow up in traditional religion, there's a lot of hiding behind vague ideas that sound good. And there's not a lot of defining what that actually means. And oftentimes, it even harkens back to like a 1984-esque usage of language. War is peace, peace is war. Alliance Defending Freedom is actually about getting rid of a lot of your freedoms. And so I just mentioned that to be on guard with the way that Christian nationalist organizations use language. Because the Alliance Defending Freedom is very much against rights for women, very much against reproductive rights for women, very much against freedoms for marriage, very much against freedom. But they call themselves the Alliance Defending Freedom because it sounds like a good thing. So there's a lot of care that has to be placed to understanding the history and the stories behind a lot of these movements. I also wanted to mention the shooting in Lewiston, Maine. You might think, well, what in the world does that have to do with Christian nationalism? There's not any kind of religious motive behind this, and I don't think that there was. But the reason I mention it again is as an encouragement for all of us to find ways to maintain your relationships even with people who are starting to go really far into the fringes of Christian nationalist, white supremacist kind of rhetoric. To find ways to kind of keep in contact sometimes with people, even as they go down deeper and deeper into these rabbit holes. Because I think another thing that's happening with violence among especially young white men is that people are getting really pulled into online realities. And what I often say is that, this isn't something that you're going to argue people out of, or you're not going to reason or rationalize people out of some of these ideologies or groups. But what is important, and I'm sure any of you who've been with a loved one who's been through addiction, been through alcoholism, sometimes the only thing you can do is maintain this sense of trust enough that you're going to be there when that person is ready to change or when that person is ready to be in need. And so I often find that like a 12-step model or recovery model is the right way to approach, especially those loved ones in your life who you feel like they've just completely lost any sense of reason or logic or normalcy, and they've gotten completely lost in these online environments of rage or violence. And sometimes the best tool against combating some of that is just refusing to completely let our social networks fray. Finally, I said I would mention Israel and Palestine. There's a lot in the book about the partnership between white evangelicals and right-wing Israeli government. And what's really instructive and interesting about that, and I want to say off the top that what happened on October 7th was absolutely unacceptable, and I feel like it's especially important for me as a German Lutheran to say that anti-Semitism is very much alive and well. And white Christians, white American Christians, have to explicitly condemn anti-Semitism over and over and over again. So I'm not in any way saying that what happened on October 7th was not only an act of anti-Semitism, but something that white Christians need to actively condemn over and over and over again. But what I did want to mention is that part of the climate in Israel leading up to these attacks was an ongoing partnership and an embrace of the kind of religious nationalism that we're seeing in America. They were also beginning to see in the Israeli right wing. So they're beginning to dismantle their Supreme Court. They were beginning to dismantle many of the legal protections that supported some of the equal rights in Israel. And there was this partnership. And what I think it's important to remember about this partnership that you'll often hear between white evangelicals in America and Israeli right-wing officials is that if you follow those trends out to the end, those two groups are never going to agree because both of them have the other ones ending up pretty much in hell. And so you see that the connection between the two is not based on religious faith, but instead on a shared pursuit of, again, power and money. Power and money. Power and money. And often a shared sense of whiteness. And so all these things, as they come together, we see over and over again throughout the history of the world that the place where those things end up is in violence and death, especially the death of those who are most vulnerable, of children, the elderly, the poor. Okay, definition. I'll have Christian maybe send this out to the group after too, if I give it to you in email. Christian nationalism is a version of the idolatrous theology of glory, which replaces the genuine worship of God with worship of a particular vision of America, often rooted in a revisionist history of white people in the 1950s, before the civil rights movement or the women's movement. Christian nationalism supports a violent takeover of government and the imposition of fundamentalist Christian beliefs on all people. Christian nationalism relies on a theological argument that equates American military sacrifice with Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. It suggests that Christians are entitled to wealth and power, in contrast to Jesus' theology of the cross, which reminds Christians that they too have to carry their cross, just as our crucified Savior did. So real quick explanation of terms. Theology of glory. This goes all the way back to Martin Luther. But theology of glory goes back really all the way to the Tower of Babel. And theology of glory is this sense that if you follow God, if you do what the Bible is supposed to say, that you will amass worldly power, esteem, and wealth. So very analogous to the prosperity gospel. But the theology of glory, you can also see it operating. The reason that Martin Luther wrote about it is because the Catholic Church at his time was really operating under a theology of glory mindset. So they've built these huge cathedrals. We have the Holy Roman Empire, where the Pope and the Emperor were both the highest political official in the land. Everybody in whatever land they were followed whatever the political leader's religion was. So there was a very strong sense of theology of glory. I already explained theology of the cross. But again, it's that reminder of the paradox of Christian life. And you can see this in some of Christianity's most powerful and influential leaders. that those who are often most rejected by the world, those who face the most challenge, the most rejection, are often the ones in whom God is working most powerfully. And so it's a reminder to you as well in your life, if you feel rejected, if you feel like nothing you're doing is working, and as I often say to small local churches too, or large local churches too, that the theology of the cross reminds you that if you feel like, oh my gosh, our best days are far behind us, that God is often doing God's best work when you also feel like you're failing according to the world's standards. Can I have somebody read for me John 18:33 through 37? I think we have some Bibles out there, or maybe you have a Bible on your phone. If I don't have anyone itching to read it, I think, Christian, you could read it too. But
Oh, no. You don't let them off the hook that easily. Can I get a volunteer?
all right.
Great, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?"
So 2 lessons I want us to take from that passage. Thank you for reading. The first one is Jesus' explicit rejection of Christian nationalism. My kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is not of this world. Again, much of the unspoken rhetoric underneath Christian nationalism is that America is meant to be Jesus' kingdom. That America is the shining city on the hill. And you'll note this is bipartisan rhetoric, right? We've been talking this way in America about America for a long time, and some of it's been for righteous causes. But Jesus explicitly reminds us here, my kingdom is not of this world. Jesus very explicitly rejects the aims of Christian nationalism in this passage. Now, an extreme reading of this passage can sometimes give rise to a theological argument called two kingdoms theory. That theory uses Jesus' conversation with the disciples, with the Pharisees, when he says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's." And so in Lutheranism, we know this well because it gave rise to something that's still very prominent in Minnesota, which is Lutheran quietism. And it's this sense of a lot of church folks to say, well, we shouldn't get involved in these things. We need to focus on the church. We need to focus on the religious realm. We need to focus on getting people to heaven, getting people saved. This isn't for us to deal with. And so what Dietrich Bonhoeffer did is he wrote an amendment to Two Kingdoms theory, written especially for his time, but for our time as well, was that we are called as Christians to step into the world on behalf of the theology of the cross when individual human lives and dignity and the bearing of the image of God on every single person is being threatened by a violent takeover of government, many times with religious overtones. And so this idea of two kingdoms theory doesn't mean that churches should just stay out. And I know this church knows this well too. in times of injustice, in times of violence, in times of dehumanization. This conversation between Jesus and Pilate, I also just want you to notice in it real quickly that Pilate is not interested in a forthright conversation with Jesus. Pilate instead is responding much the way someone might respond in a social media argument. Because instead of responding to Jesus with a good faith response and going back and forth and listening to what he said, Pilate's just whatabouting Jesus. Well, what about this? What about this? Jesus tells him very, very clearly, my kingdom is not of this world. And Pilate says, but so you are a king? It reminded me of conversations I've actually had with people who do much the same thing. And so the last piece I'll leave you with, and then I want to get into our conversation, is that you need to have discernment when doing this kind of work. And notice who your partners are. Jesus says the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And so to really discern, to not end up spending your time arguing with people who aren't interested in finding common hope, common ground, common solutions. And to really spend your time looking for people who do want to work together, people who do want to reach understanding, people who do want to follow the gospel of Jesus, not the gospel of Christian nationalism. And so I just encourage you to look back at this conversation between Jesus and Pilate from time to time, because it's going to help you ascertain when you're getting into an unhealthy loop with someone, when someone's maybe looking to deceive you or to deceive your organization, and when someone is looking to just exhaust you. And also remember that Jesus very clearly says, my kingdom is not of this world. So we are called not, as many of us have been told even since we were little baby Christians, our task is not to build your kingdom here, but instead our task is to help people reclaim their common humanity, to help search for peace, for understanding, for preservation of life, and for human rights. So let's take some questions. And I do want to hear specifically where you're seeing this in your community, and what kind of examples you have or questions you have.
My question is, the people that we're referring to tonight as white Christian nationalists, do they think of themselves as white Christian nationalists, or do they think of themselves as right-thinking Christians?
Yeah, I don't think that I've thought about it often, it's when you're doing work in anti-racism, you're not doing that work in order so that you can turn to your neighbor and say, well, yes, I know you're a racist. And we're not trying to understand Christian nationalism tonight in order so that we can turn to our neighbor and say, well, I know you're a Christian nationalist. Because first of all, I do think it's really important for us to examine ourselves, and because there are vestiges of Christian nationalism within all places, and it's really important to first examine where is it in my life. But no, I don't think most people identify as Christian nationalists. There are a few. There's actually a pastor out in, Waseca, Minnesota, who co-wrote a book defending Christian nationalism with the founder of Gab.com. Gab.com has been kind of a hotbed for white supremacists. So right here in Waseca, I just did a class with a bunch of pastors from southern Minnesota, and they were talking about how this movement, this pastor ended up leading the baccalaureate service at Waseca High School. And the whole thing was Christian nationalism. So there are some folks, but I think overwhelmingly, I was just part of a group, mostly of evangelicals, that put together a new survey on Christian nationalism. And one of the big things that they identified is sort of the largest group of people, and this is likely a group of people that's going to be pivotal in upcoming elections as well, are people that kind of sympathize with some of the ideas of Christian nationalism, but would not identify as such. And again, this is where language is really important too. Because if you say, well, are you a fan of freedom? Are you a fan of patriotism? Are you a fan of supporting the troops? So we really have to go underneath it and figure out what is the end game, what is the aim. And again, sometimes it's that recovery model of just maintaining a trust, maintaining a relationship until someone kind of starts to come to you and say, oh, some of this that I've been following isn't adding up. And I have experienced that does happen. It does. Yeah.
I'm concerned about the fact that pastors are standing up and promoting this ideology, understanding that people have to go to Bible school and come to a deeper understanding of what the scriptures really mean. And I find it hard to understand how they can step aside from their biblical teaching to promote a way of life that doesn't necessarily reflect what the scriptures have instructed them.
Well, unfortunately, the requirement for pastoral education is not even across the board. So there's a lot of people, you're charismatic, you can get, Paula White didn't go to seminary. So there is a lot of, there's just, you're charismatic. And sometimes people are well-meaning and then they get swept up into it. And so I do think at the same time, I do still think the majority of pastors are not for this ideology.
It's like allowing someone who's not a brain surgeon to do surgery on you.
Yeah, I'm with you, but the pastors making the biggest salaries in this country most of the time are not seminary trained.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. We're going to get you a good workout tonight, Christian.
You've given some interviews that I've seen on YouTube, and I don't think your responses were as theological as they are here. In fact, you got down to real fundamental issues. And one of the ones you talked about, especially for evangelicals, was an old fundamentalist idea about the rapture, end times, and that's one of the reasons why evangelicals have supported Israel. Can you talk a little bit about some of these red-hot issues that really hit at the core that people vote? Most people do not vote about some kind of ideology or theology. You implied that when you talked about the poverty and the loss of hope in a lot of other communities that really supported Trump.
Yeah, I don't think people consciously vote according to theology, but I do think theology plays a big role in American elections. And I say that because the way that people view God, who God is to people, does have an impact on how people view the political arena or elections. So even for people who are not religious at all, reject all, if there's a sense in their mind that God is domineering, angry, male, masculine, that's going to really fundamentally be a different type of worldview. But we're talking about the end times. So when we get back to Mike Johnson, new Speaker of the House, his life intersects a lot with Tim LaHaye. You guys know who Tim LaHaye is. So Left Behind books. Just this whole, I grew up with this, right? I got left behind for my birthday in 4th grade from a friend of mine.
Oh.
She is now a lawyer and she came out of Regent University, which is one of the most conservative, yeah. Yeah. Yes. And actually this Christian nationalism study, we just had a guy professor from there. But that does play a huge role in this. And it is also this sense that if you think the end times are coming right around the corner, you behave differently, right? You're more willing to excuse violence. You're more willing to excuse impropriety if you think everything is a last battle. And the other thing I'll say too is depictions of Jesus. So notice how Jesus is depicted in Christian nationalist rhetoric. I was just doing a bunch of reading on some of the main proponents of Christian nationalist sort of very hardcore masculine Jesus. Mark Driscoll, pastor out of Seattle, is one of them. You would be surprised by how often they reference Revelation and the Christ of Revelation. So riding in on a white horse as a warrior, that's a much more common depiction of Jesus. It's kind of that and Jesus turning over the temples. That's it. Those are the main ways that Jesus is depicted. And so again, yes, the end times, hugely operative in all of this. And again, it gives you, it's that sense of purpose, that sense of we're in something really important, rather than you're getting up, you're paying your bills, you've got a bunch of loan debt, you've got a dead-end job, whatever it is. Let's see. Yeah, I think we got maybe a couple more. Yeah.
I'd like you to say a little bit more about the military connection with this, because the former president came into office looking like he was a champion of the military in every way you can imagine. But in the last couple of years, ever since he left office, he's done nothing but disparage notable leaders, and the conservative party in this country has failed to deliver things that have been normal things we've accepted them to respect and deliver for the good of the country. So is this breaking down within the military and the people that serve, or is it still, and do we not understand it?
I think there's a bit of a breakdown. At the beginning of this month, I was in rural Minnesota, and one of the people that I was talking with most is he's a military veteran who later became a chaplain. He recently, from 2019 to 2021, was deployed to Iraq and to Kuwait, I believe, and saw some really hard things even at that time. And he said, you know, to be honest, he had that sense, and a lot of the people he knew in the military had that sense, was, okay, this guy's going to come in and be our champion. And I think that there's an appeal. A lot of this goes underneath, you know, bold-faced facts, right? The bold-faced facts is that, you know, Trump avoided war. The bold-faced facts is that he never did serve in the military, but he gets the rhetoric really right. And there's also a lot of strains in the military that you see in policing as well. And so there is a strong appeal to whiteness. There's a common experience of police officers and military folks who, when they're coming into contacts, these are super broad generalizations, super, super broad. But there's a lot of white military officers, and by the way, the military is becoming one of the most diverse organizations and groups in America. But for a lot of the white young men serving the military or serving as police officers, a lot of the interactions that they'll have with people of color are adversarial. And there ends up being just an element of racism and an element of that just, it's fed into, and sometimes it gets, I don't know if, have Democrats or progressives always done the best job of speaking to police officers, speaking to military? I don't know. Probably there's been some errors there too. But yeah, I mean, I think it's changing. That guy who I talked to, he did say, as Trump had come out against Mark Milley, he said that was a big mistake. People in the military are going to rally behind Milley. That was his perspective. I think that maybe there's some truth to that. I think right now we saw yesterday a lot of Republican senators criticizing Tommy Tuberville for these holds on military promotions. Thank you. And it's causing a lot of delays in just everyday life for military folks. There's a respect for the chain of command that Trump hasn't had. There's a respect for tradition. So I think some of that's breaking down, but there's a lot of other stuff. So tomorrow I'm going to the Citadel, and I'm going to be, so maybe I'll have a better answer for you after that. But this stuff is just so layered, right? And the military is doing its best to address things like sexual assault within the military, to address prejudices within the military. They're trying to make some, and with that change comes backlashes. And with that change, and so I think it's yeah, I mean, I think that there's some cracks in it, but there's a lot of things that came together that Trump tried to bring together in getting military support that it's going to be hard to break down. I mean, you have Ukraine right now too, that a lot of Republicans. So there's a lot has changed since 2015. Yeah, I think 2 more.
Hold on, Mary. Mary, hold on.
I don't fit anywhere. And, you know, I come to learn. I'm not closed off. I'm not, I believe that there is no true one answer as far as society is concerned. I believe that Jesus is the true one answer. But I'm sitting here looking and feeling this and reading all of this huge mess, and I don't fit. So it's like I have to figure out what I can do best to serve the Lord in where I am. But I don't want anything to do with all this fighting.
Thank you.
You mentioned, and it resonated, that a lot of what's going on is they want power and money, the prosperity gospel, but the people who, since the Civil War, felt the country has been taken from them want power. And I don't know that they would deny that. I've read things like from, Franklin Graham, who say, in essence, yeah, we want the power because we're going to save the country. And so I don't think you'd get an argument with that. If we say power just to boss people around, they won't go with that. But they say, yeah, we want to take the power however we can get it. And that's, that's quite alarming because people who are on a crusade can do a lot of damage.
I think my response to that, especially as a pastor and as a Christian, is that's fine. That's great. But you don't get to also say you're following Jesus then. If that's great, own that. That's your pursuit. Then you can't also claim that you're following Jesus and that you have the mantle and the cloak of righteousness on your back. Because if you're nakedly pursuing power, it just doesn't comport with the gospel of Jesus. To make it better. Yeah. That was never how Jesus worked.
Right. Ends do not justify means. Do you have time for another one?
Let's get one last one, I think, right over here.
Mary.
Thank you guys so much. It's been a great discussion.
So my question for you is, so what do we do now? So if I am someone who, as we look forward to upcoming elections, would like for Christian nationalism to not prevail, what do we do?
Yeah. Well, you're asking a journalist, which our whole thing is, we'll just give you all the information figured out. And then you're asking a Lutheran, and my whole thing is, well, grace. No. One thing I think maybe the first step is to just acknowledge and look around and see all the things you're already doing, first of all. So you came here tonight. Now, as you look around, you see you have a lot of people who may want to work on things with you together later, whether it's to have more education nights, whether it's to maybe you find a local candidate you want to knock on doors for. I still have that journalist and maybe pastor thing sometimes where I'm like, I feel weird about partisan stuff, but you don't have to do that. That's just my thing, and I should probably let it go. Also, what do we do now? I mean, it also maybe sounds trite, but I do think we have to say we pray. We do continue to pray. You do continue to, just the fact that we have this space, right? You continue to support your church, to have local congregations where these kind of conversations can take place, that kids are being formed in a kind of Christianity that's not this kind of Christian nationalism Christianity. I think sometimes progressive Christians, and I don't know if y'all would identify that way, but whatever, mainline Christians, I don't know what the proper term is, but we have a tendency to be way too hard on ourselves And to just think, oh, the church is dying. Oh, the budget's bad. Oh, we got all this maintenance we got to do. Oh, there weren't many people in church on Sunday. I think there needs to be more of a sense of, what do we have to be proud of? What assets do we have in this place? What kind of legacy do we have to leave? What is, I don't know what the situation is here. I know for a lot of Lutheran churches, we have a lot of money that we've set aside for a rainy day. And maybe it's time to think, well, it's raining. It's been raining. What should we do with some of this stuff? Because, and again, I see this with Minnesota Lutherans. I've served in other parts of the country where you could fit all the ELCA Lutherans into a tiny minivan, And here we are in Minnesota. We've got all this influence and we have assets, and the whole thing is, oh, well, I don't know. All these other groups, they've got more people there, they've got more attention. And so I do think it is, what to do now is to take stock and look around, okay, what is our witness? What is our legacy? Who are the partners we want to work with it on? And how do we just start to have a voice as to, what does Jesus look like to us? And I do think you guys have already done that here too. You've done some hard work in that area. So it's a great example. But we'll see. We're in it together. I'll be praying with you. Thank you guys so much.
Let's thank our speaker. Angela, thank you so much for being here. Thank you all for coming. One of the reasons that we host the Faith and Justice Forum, we're going to have one in the fall and one in the spring, is precisely to have vital conversations about important topics that might sometimes make you nervous or make you feel tense, but it's real. This is real life, real lived stuff that you see on the TV, questions that you have in your heart and mind. What am I going to do with my time? What am I going to do with my talent? What am I going to do with my treasure? How do I live with my neighbor, etc.? So I'm so thankful to have all of you come. I want to remind you that we will have another one of these events in April. We're going to have another local author, and the title of her book is Faith and Fake News. So we will also be exploring themes connected to the election, because that's the cycle that we're in right now. But thank you so much. There are, again, copies in the back. I know Angela would be happy to sign those. You can also come forward. There's also a sign-up going around for your Substack newsletter. I get that as well. It gives you great insights into some of the events that are happening current day. So again, blessings as you all go forth this night, and thank you for coming.